By the time Germany finally mobilized its economy for total war in 1943,
Soviet factories were already producing tanks at 3 times the German rate.
The decision to delay full mobilization wasn't made by generals who didn't understand industrial warfare.
It was made by political leaders who believed that maintaining comfortable civilian life mattered more than winning the war.
This wasn't ignorance.
It was ideology masquerading as strategy, and it guaranteed defeat before the first Tiger tank rolled off the production line. When Germany invaded Poland in September
1939, its economy was running at barely 60% of capacity.
While Britain immediately began rationing and industrial conversion, Germany continued producing consumer goods, luxury items, and maintaining peacetime living standards.
Hitler and his inner circle believed that Germany's technical superiority and military efficiency would deliver quick victories without requiring the population to sacrifice. This assumption rested on a deeper conviction that the German people, traumatized by World War I's deprivations, could not endure another period of hardship without political instability. The Nazi leadership feared their own population more than they feared losing the war slowly. The decision to avoid total mobilization was deliberate and carefully reasoned. Hitler had observed that Germany's collapse in 1918 came not from military defeat but from civilian morale breakdown on the home front. He believed that maintaining butter alongside guns would prevent internal revolt and preserve Nazi political control. Hermann Göring famously declared that the German people should have both guns and butter, rejecting the traditional wartime choice. This was not merely propaganda. It shaped actual economic policy. Factories continued producing household goods. Women were not conscripted into industrial work.
Rationing remained relatively mild compared to Britain or the Soviet Union.
The Nazi leadership treated civilian comfort as a strategic asset rather than a luxury they could no longer afford.
Germany's industrial production in the first 3 years of the war tells a remarkable story.
While fighting a multi-front conflict, German factories produced fewer tanks in 1941 than they had in 1940. Aircraft production remained essentially flat. Ammunition output increased only marginally.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite losing massive industrial territory to German invasion, was relocating factories beyond the Urals and ramping up production to wartime emergency levels.
Britain had converted its entire economy to war production by 1941. The United States, not yet even in the war, was already building what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy.
Germany was fighting the war with an economy still partially focused on peacetime consumption.
Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the problem with clarity that terrified him.
In late 1941, he compiled detailed reports showing that Germany's production rates were insufficient for the war it was fighting. He warned Hitler directly that without total economic mobilization, Germany could not sustain a prolonged conflict against enemies with larger industrial bases. Todt's analysis was professional, documented, and irrefutable.
Hitler's response was to acknowledge the concerns but defer action. The Führer insisted that German technical quality would compensate for lower quantity and that the war would be won through operational brilliance rather than industrial output.
Todt died in a plane crash in February 1942, taking his warnings with him.
His replacement would take a different approach.
Albert Speer became Minister of Armaments in February 1942 with a mandate to increase production without disrupting civilian life. Speer was not a military man or an economist. He was an architect who had designed Nazi party buildings and enjoyed Hitler's personal favor.
But Speer possessed organizational talent and bureaucratic ruthlessness. He immediately began streamlining production, eliminating redundant military specifications, and implementing mass production techniques that German industry had resisted. Within months, production numbers began rising. But Speer faced constraints that no amount of efficiency could overcome. He was not authorized to fully mobilize the German economy. He could not conscript women into factories on a large scale. He could not eliminate consumer goods production entirely. He was trying to win an industrial war with one hand tied behind his back. By 1942, the production disparities had become impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union was producing 24,000 tanks per year. Britain was producing 8,000 aircraft annually. Germany, fighting both powers simultaneously, was producing 11,000 tanks and 15,000 aircraft. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Germany was being outproduced by margins that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. American industrial might had not yet fully entered the calculation, but intelligence reports indicated that American production would dwarf all European powers combined. German planners could see the future in spreadsheets and production tables. They were going to be buried under an avalanche of enemy equipment. The only question was whether Germany could mobilize fast enough to change the equation before it became irreversible. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, became an unexpected advocate for total war mobilization. He understood that Germany was losing the industrial race and that only complete societal commitment could change the outcome. In 1942 and early 1943, Goebbels repeatedly pressed Hitler to authorize full mobilization, including the conscription of women into war industries and the elimination of non-essential production. Hitler refused. The Führer remained convinced that imposing harsh measures on the civilian population would create the same homefront collapse that had destroyed Imperial Germany. He pointed to the relative comfort of German civilians compared to their enemies and argued that this demonstrated National Socialism's superiority. Goebbels could not overcome Hitler's psychological fixation on 1918. The trauma of Germany's previous defeat was preventing adaptation to the current war's requirements. The disaster at Stalingrad in February 1943 should have triggered immediate total mobilization. The loss of an entire army demonstrated that Germany could not win through operational skill alone. It needed mass, and mass required industrial output on a scale Germany had not yet attempted. Goebbels saw the opportunity. He delivered his famous total war speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, whipping the audience into frenzied support for complete mobilization. The crowd roared approval for any sacrifice necessary to achieve victory. But the speech was theater, not policy. Hitler authorized only partial measures. Some luxury production was curtailed. Some non-essential workers were redirected. But women remained largely outside the industrial workforce. Consumer goods production continued. The mobilization that Germany desperately needed was implemented in half measures that satisfied no one and solved nothing. Nazi ideology itself prevented the mobilization Germany required. The regime's vision of German women emphasized motherhood and domestic life, not factory work. Putting millions of women into industrial production would contradict everything the party had proclaimed about proper gender roles. Additionally, the Nazi leadership feared that mobilizing women would be seen as an admission of desperation, undermining the propaganda narrative of inevitable victory. So German factories operated with labor shortages while millions of women remained outside the workforce. Britain had mobilized women by 1941. The Soviet Union employed women in virtually every industrial role. Germany, fighting both nations simultaneously, maintained peacetime gender ideology until it was far too late.
This was not an oversight. It was ideological rigidity overriding survival necessity. By mid-1943, Speer's production increases, though impressive, could not close the gap with Allied output. Germany produced 40,000 aircraft in 1943. The combined Allied total exceeded 120,000. Germany produced 12,000 tanks. The Soviets alone produced 24,000. American production was just reaching full stride, adding massive quantities on top of British and Soviet numbers. German factories were working at capacity. Workers labored long hours. Efficiency had been maximized. But the enemy's industrial base was simply larger, and they had mobilized it earlier and more completely. Every month, the production gap widened. Every month, the mathematical probability of German victory decreased. By late 1943, German officers conducting war games could not construct realistic scenarios for victory. The numbers no longer allowed it. In 1944, with Allied armies approaching from both east and west, Germany finally implemented the total mobilization it should have begun in 1939. Goebbels was given extraordinary powers to comb through the economy and redirect every possible resource to war production. Non-essential businesses were closed. Luxury production ceased entirely. Bureaucrats were conscripted into the military or factory work. Women were finally mobilized on a large scale. Production reached its highest levels of the war in late 1944, a remarkable achievement given the strategic bombing campaign and loss of occupied territories. But this surge came far too late. The Allies had already accumulated overwhelming material superiority. The Red Army had stockpiled massive reserves. The Western Allies had established unshakable footholds in France and Italy. Germany's belated industrial mobilization was like a drowning man finally learning to swim. The effort was commendable. The timing made it irrelevant. Military historians still debate what might have happened had Germany mobilized fully in 1939 or 1940. With 2 extra years of maximum production, Germany might have fielded significantly larger forces during the crucial campaigns of 1941 and 1942. But this analysis misses the deeper point. Full mobilization in 1939 would have required Nazi leadership to abandon core ideological commitments about civilian comfort, gender roles, and the symbolic importance of maintaining prosperity. It would have required acknowledging that Germany was in a desperate struggle for survival from the beginning, contradicting the propaganda narrative of easy Aryan supremacy. The decision not to mobilize fully was not a miscalculation. It was a choice that flowed logically from Nazi ideology. A regime that could have made different choices would have been a fundamentally different regime. The delay in mobilization cost Germany the war, but the timing reveals something important about strategic decision-making. The right decision implemented too late becomes the wrong decision. Germany's 1944 mobilization demonstrated that the Nazi state could organize total war when forced to. But by implementing that mobilization 5 years into the war instead of at the beginning, Germany ensured that the effort would be futile. The industrial advantage that the Allies gained between 1939 and 1943 was never overcome. Germany spent the last years of the war losing slowly instead of losing quickly, but the outcome was identical. Every German soldier who died after 1943 died in a war that mathematics had already decided. The failure to mobilize early was not the only reason Germany lost World War II, but it made all of Germany's other strategic errors impossible to overcome. Germany's delayed mobilization was not an isolated mistake. It fit a pattern that characterized Nazi decision-making throughout the war. When faced with choices between ideological purity and strategic necessity, Hitler's regime consistently chose ideology. When warned that their choices would lead to defeat, Nazi leaders insisted that willpower and racial superiority would overcome material disadvantage. When the consequences of their decisions became undeniable, they blamed subordinates, bad luck, or betrayal rather than examining their own strategic logic. This pattern appeared in military operations, economic planning, and political strategy. The refusal to mobilize was simply the most consequential example of a broader dysfunction. The Nazi regime was structurally incapable of the kind of realistic self-assessment and adaptation that prolonged wars require. The story of Germany's failed mobilization offers a case study in how leadership failures compound over time. The decision not to mobilize in 1939 was based on the trauma of 1918. That decision created production deficits by 1941. Those deficits became irreversible by 1943. By 1944, maximum mobilization could not change the outcome. Each year's failure constrained the next year's options until no good options remained. This is how strategic mistakes work in practice. They do not announce themselves with immediate catastrophe. They quietly foreclose future possibilities until catastrophe becomes the only remaining future. Leaders who cannot adapt their thinking to changing circumstances do not suddenly fail. They fail gradually, then irreversibly, then completely. By the war's end, the production numbers told a story that no propaganda could obscure. The Soviet Union had produced over 100,000 tanks. The United States had produced nearly 90,000. Britain added 30,000. Germany, fighting all three, produced 50,000. In aircraft, the disparity was even more extreme. The Allies produced over 600,000 aircraft. Germany produced 120,000. These were not marginal differences. They were overwhelming asymmetries that made defeat mathematically certain regardless of tactical excellence or individual courage. Germany had fielded one of history's most effective military forces and led it with considerable operational skill. None of that mattered because Germany's leadership had chosen to fight an industrial war without mobilizing for industrial production until the outcome was already determined. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the question was not why it lost but how it lasted as long as it did. The answer involved tactical excellence, defensive advantages, interior lines, and the sacrifice of millions of soldiers fighting for a cause most would not have chosen. But underlying all of that was a strategic decision made in 1939 and maintained until far too late, that Germany could win a multi-front industrial war without industrial mobilization. This was never realistic. It was never sound strategy. It was always a form of magical thinking that confused ideological confidence with strategic capability. The Nazi leadership believed that their worldview made them superior to enemies with larger populations and greater resources. That belief allowed them to delay total mobilization until the delay itself guaranteed defeat. In the end, Germany lost the war not on the battlefield but in the factories that were never built, the workers who were never mobilized, and the industrial surge that came 5 years too late to matter.